All right, we are talking today about plant reproduction. So you talked about lots of aspects of plant physiology yesterday in your gallery walk, phototrophism and all that kind of fun stuff. But we are now moving into plant reproduction. So flowers and fruit is the topic for the day. And I think this background just looks gorgeous. Yes. Yes. Okay. So, reproduction. Plants can reproduce either sexually or asexually. Not every species of plant does asexual reproduction, but lots of them do. So, when they reproduce asexually, some examples would be budding, where a plant is living there, and all of a sudden another plant starts to grow out of the base of that plant. And so that's budding. You can see this happening in a lot of wild plants. I'm glad I've said it a couple times that people don't reproduce this way. Walking along, trying to put your shoes on one day, and you're like, I got a baby there. Okay. Yeah. They sell special pregnancy shoes that has a little pocket for the baby to grow in. That'd be weird. That'd be weird. But plants, that happens that way. And then sometimes the budded plant, sends out its own roots and then severs itself from the parent. And sometimes they are forever growing off of mom and dad. There are some humans that are like that, though, too, that just never leave on, failure to launch. But anyway, budding is one of them. The underground stem is another. We talked about this a little bit when we talked about like ferns that have the rhizoid that go out just under the surface and then create more ferns. It's more common with the quote-unquote lower plants, the ferns and the mosses and those kinds of things. It's more common to see the underground stem there. But there are some angiosperms and some conifers that do that as well, but not as many. And then artificially, people have made new plants out of parent plants, with totally non-natural means, like grafting, where you take a branch of one tree and you cut it carefully, and then you go walk that branch over to another tree, where you cut off that tree's branch and you stick this branch on it. And now this tree is doing that thing too. Obviously, if it's two branches of the same species, that doesn't make much sense. It's a whole lot of work to get one orange branch onto another orange tree. But there are trees that have branches from an entirely different species. And then you can have this one tree produce multiple kinds of fruit, which is kind of spiffy. So there are multi-fruit fruit trees that you can buy that have like one limb that makes one kind of fruit, and one limb that makes another kind of fruit. So it's kind of interesting. And then propagation. This is very common with trees, where you cut a young branch, and then you take that branch and you stick it in a bath of hormones and rooting hormones, and then the branch is like, all of a sudden I feel like a tree. And out of the end of the branch grow roots, and you go plant the branch and it becomes a tree. You can do that with lots of species of plants. You can even do that with leaves of some plants. All you need is a leaf, and you put it in rooting hormone, and the leaf grows roots, and plants grow up top. So that's kind of interesting. Culturing as well, where this is more laboratory sort of stuff, but you get cells from a plant, and then you trick those cells to become entirely new plants, kind of like cloning. So these are artificial ways of doing asexual reproduction. These are natural ways of doing asexual reproduction. But of course, the dominant reproductive plan for at least the higher plants, for gymnosperms and for conifers, is sexual reproduction. That's the dominant way to do this. So a flower is a reproductive structure. It's a reproductive organ of the plant. And so it's these flowers are there to make babies, make baby plants. And they didn't have to be pretty, but God has allowed them to also be beautiful. And so we give them to each other here, have reproductive organs. It's kind of strange. But these things are there for the plant to reproduce. The structures of a flower, we're going to talk about the structures of the flower going from the outside into the middle. So the outside of a flower, the outermost layer of it is usually just looks like a leaf, but they're thicker. It's like a double leaf, thick leaf. And when the bud is growing and developing, these sepals protect the developing bud. So they're like the shield around the baby flower as it's developing inside this protected area. And then when the flower is ready to go, the sepals pull back and usually die off pretty quick because the flower doesn't tend to use the sepals anymore once the flower is set. So they're thick, green, leaf-like structures which protect the flower while it's developing. And then, of course, the main feature of a flower for us as consumers of flower beauty is the petal. The petal is what it's all about for us when we look at a flower and say, gosh, that's pretty. Of course, for a flower, the petal is not what it's all about. It's all about the stuff that makes seeds, which is deeper into the flower. But the petals are also what attract the insects. Bees and moths and butterflies and hummingbirds and things of that nature that come to pollinate the flower are attracted there by the petals. So the petals are meant to be pretty. They are designed to be beautiful. And we think that they're beautiful, and so we cut them off and give them to each other, and the plant is like, darn, that was too pretty. Now I don't get to have baby plants with that flower. But that's their job. That's why they were designed that way, is to attract things to the flower. The plant is hoping that it attracts pollinating creatures, but it attracts us as well. And they are there also to attract pollinators and then to protect the gametes inside. Sepals don't normally close on a nightly basis, but frequently petals do. Frequently petals will close up at night and then open up again in the day. And that is to keep the dew and the moisture from washing the pollen off of the plant, off of the flower. So when the petal closes at night, it's to protect the pollen and make sure that dew doesn't gather on it and wash the pollen away, and then the pollen doesn't get to find its way to another flower. So petals close and open on a daily basis for many flowers. Some of them are open and are just open, but most of them close and open. And then they're also there to say, hey, ain't I pretty? Don't you want to come say hey to me? Then when we look past the petal, the stamen are reproductive structures which are composed of filaments supporting an anther. Boy, there's a lot of vocabulary on this page. And you'll see a picture of it in a moment, and it'll be clearer. But a stamen is the entire male reproductive structure. And it has two parts. It has the filament, which is a long filament. It's well named. It's a long tube. And at the end of the filament is this structure that makes the pollen. The structure up there is called an anther, not an antler, right? Different. Antler and anther, very different things. If two deer were fighting over a doe and they were fighting with anthers, that would be really silly. But antlers make more sense. So filaments are tube-like things, and the anther sits at the top, and it makes pollen. And pollen is the male gamete. And just like in the animal world, the male gamete is the one that moves and goes to the female gamete. The female gamete, the ova or the egg, sits inside the flower and waits for the pollen to come. So it's a corollary to the animal world as well. And so the pollen can travel various different ways. A lot of plants rely, like I said before, on pollinating bugs or even on pollinating birds. But some plants just release their pollen into the wind, and then they hope that the wind carries it to the right place. So that's the male gamete. The female gamete or the female reproductive structure is a tall, thicker tube coming out of the middle of the plant, the middle of the flower. and that's called the carpel. The carpel is the name of the entire structure. Okay, and just like the male reproductive structure has two parts, the female reproductive structure has two parts. The carpel or the pistil is the whole thing, and then on the tube holding it up, the supporting structure we call the style. And so female plants have style. And then the sticky part that catches the pollen is called the stigma. So either a bug or a bird or the wind blows the pollen from a male flower to a female flower. And then the stigma is sitting there gathering pollen. And when the right kind of pollen lands on the stigma, then a process begins that we'll get into in a little bit that turns that flower into a fruit. And it gets to make eggs and seeds and things inside. Okay. So let me show you some pictures here. Oh, just kidding. One more slide before pictures. I get pictures next. At the base of the pistil is the ovary, or the base of the carpel is the ovary. And it contains ovules, which are the female gametes. And they develop into seeds when they're fertilized. So the flower, typically, if you look at a flower, the pretty part is on top. And then there tends to be like a bulbous thing at the bottom of the flower. And that bulbous thing at the bottom of the flower is where the ovum are. And that's where the seeds will develop, and that's what will become the fruit. So, let's see, here we go. I brought an orange for lunch. Where's my orange? There's my orange. Okay. The orange has two, like holes to it, right? There's a little black dot on this side of the orange, and then there's the bigger green thing at this end of the orange. This is where the orange was attached to the tree. And this is where the flower that became the orange was attached to the tree at the bigger part. But this little scar right here, this little black point at the other end of the orange, that's where there used to be an orange flower. And all the petals and the pistil and all of that was all attached here. And what is now my orange used to be a shriveled up little tiny green thing at the base of the flower. And then when the flower did its job and it got fertilized, the flower fell off. And the green little pea thing at the base of the flower swelled and became this, which I'm going to eat in a little while. So the orange is the bottom part, the ovary of the flower that develops into the fruit. Okay, so flowers are our future fruit. Here we go. So the sepals in this flower that we're looking at are these green, thick, protective structures at the base. And in this particular flower, they're a whole lot shorter than the petals. They protect the bud while it's developing, but the petals outgrow the sepals. So that's not always the case, but in this flower it is. The sepals are down here. The petals, obviously, are the pretty part that make you and I and pollinators look at it and say, oh, that's pretty. If you were to cut the flower in half, now you see the male reproductive structures here, which tend to be a little bit shorter than the female reproductive structure. Okay, so these are all stigma. I'm sorry, not stigma. These are all stamen, and then the stamen is composed of a filament, a tube, and then the anther holding the pollen at the top. So this is making pollen. And then this happens to be a perfect flower where there are both male and female parts on the same flower. And so this one has male reproductive parts and a female reproductive part. And this central shaft that is thicker than the stamen is the pistil, is the female reproductive structure. And it's composed of a style, which is the tube here. And then at the top of the style is the stigma, the sticky part trying to catch pollen. So when pollen is caught, it will be carried down the style, and then this is the ovary. This will eventually become the fruit and develop the seeds. Okay? And then the part where all of this joins the bush is called the receptacle, and that wasn't on your notes. But that's there. So this will become the fruit. Another picture. Here's another flower that's been cut in half so we can see it. Here's a sepal, and here's another sepal. So these are the protective structures. There's another sepal that would have protected it while it was developing. Of course, the petals. Here we have anthers on filaments. Okay, filament, anther. And then this is the style of the pistil. This is the ovary. This is what will become fruit. And at the top, kind of out of focus, is the stigma. That's what's trying to catch the pollen. Here, this is a picture of a flower not dissected. And then here it is dissected. So again, sepals and petals, sepals and petals. And then cut in half, we can see little stamen out here with filaments and anthers. And then a whole bunch of pistils, a whole bunch of female structures with a whole bunch of stigma on top trying to catch pollen. Okay? I don't know. To a bee, it tastes very good. And it eventually becomes honey for us. So. When, we've said before, when the stigma catches pollen, either because an animal went from one flower to another or because the wind blew just right, the pollen then says, hey, I'm on a flower. The flower says, hey, I got some pollen. And the pollen grows a pollen tube down through the style to the ovary and fertilizes the ovum. Now, this is not initially easy to grasp, that the pollen is what grows down through the flower and touches the female gametes down to the base of the flower. It seems kind of logical that the flower would be like, hey, pollen, let me grab the pollen and let me pull it down through. But the flower is passive in this whole thing. It's the pollen that grows a tube and sends its DNA through the tube down through the flower and goes into the ovary. Okay? So the ovary gets fertilized as the DNA, the haploid nuclei of the pollen, fuses with the haploid nuclei of the ovum, and now you have a diploid zygote inside the flower. And the flower knows that this has happened, and so it says, okay, I'm done. I've done my job. I have fertilized eggs. And all the petals fall off. All of the external reproductive structures, the pistil and the stamen, they all fall off. And then the green part of the flower, the ovary, starts to develop into a fruit. Every flower becomes a fruit. We don't tend to think about it that way because most of what you think of as a fruit is something like that orange that you would buy at the grocery store. But there, you're going to see in a moment, there's tons of kinds of fruit. And so every flower out there becomes fruit. It's just maybe not the kind that you will eat. And inside the fruit, there are seeds. Now, there's some exceptions to that. Sometimes the fruit wears its seeds on the outside. Can somebody think of an example of that? Fruit, yeah, strawberries. Strawberry wears its seeds on the outside, but that's the exception to the rule. Most of the time, they wear, yes, most of the time the seeds are on the inside. Okay, so this is an X-ray micrograph where they pollinated a flower with radioactive pollen. So this is not a normal thing, but they took pollen from a species of flower and they irradiated the pollen so that it was radioactive. and then they put this radioactive pollen on a flower, and they let it develop, and then they took X-ray pictures with it, and you're able to see that the pollen, because the pollen glows in the picture, it's the pollen that grows the tube down. It's not the flower that somehow grabs the pollen. So this is radioactive pollen growing down through a tube of a flower, and then they zoom in on the ovary, and now the ovaries are glowing because they've been fertilized with radioactive pollen. So kind of a weird experiment, but it makes a neat picture where you can see the pollen doing its thing. So blueberries, you can see on the blueberry the remnants of the petals. Those little, wavy things at the end of a blueberry is where the flower used to be. And this is the ovary turning into the fruit. This is, these are grapes. These are the grape flowers. And on the bottom of a grape flower, it doesn't really even have very many petals to speak of. This is the future grape, the ovary with a pistil and the stigma on it, and these are the filaments in the anthers for a grape flower. And when the pollen gets to the stigma, then the pistils fall off and the ovary swells, and we have grapes. Grapes are what? All right. So what kinds of fruits are there? Oh boy, there are so many kinds of fruits. The full table of all the kinds of fruits is on page 338 of your book. I'm not going to go through them all in lecture because you would like to go home today. But we're going to hit a couple of them. And so you get a sampling for it. But you do need to study the table on page 338 and get to know all the different kinds of fruits that are out there. Okay, so I'm going to give you a second to write this down. So there are simple fruits, and then there are compound fruits, and then there are dry fruits and fleshy fruits. Those are kind of the categories you should have in your mind. So first we're going to look at simple, and we're going to look at dry. So simple dry fruits. These are things that you may not think of as fruit, but they are, because they came out of a fertilized flower, so that makes it a fruit. A legume is one example of that. Peanuts and peas and beans and things of that nature, where it splits down the middle, and then the ovary splits down the middle, and then when you pull the ovary apart, there are seeds in there. Okay, so snap peas, sweet peas, any kind of bean, and peanuts all fall into that. A samara is something that has wings. There's one-winged samaras and two-winged samaras. But that's where the flower gets fertilized, is usually in trees high up in the air. And the flower gets fertilized, the flower falls off, some kind of pod grows. And then the pod explodes when it's ready to go. And it releases winged seeds that hopefully the wind is right, and it catches these seeds and the seeds get scattered. Or at the very least, even if there's no wind, when the pod pops, it releases these things that glide a little bit away from mom and dad tree and land at some distance. So winged seeds. Maples are a good example of that. A nut, you know what nuts are. Nuts are fruit that have a thick, hard ovary wall, and inside the ovary wall is the seed. And you've got to do some work to get to that seed. So pecans, walnuts, acorns, those kinds of things. Okay, and then an achene is a similar idea. The flower falls off, the ovary wall dries up, and gets to be a hard wall that protects the seed. But the difference is that an achene is really easy to break into. Pumpkin seeds, sunflower seeds, those sorts of things. So I have here one of the things that I brought for lunch as well is a cashew cluster. Here I have cashews and almonds and pumpkin seeds. So 3 of the kinds of fruit are here, my little cashew cluster. Because a cashew is a legume. They grow in a shell, and you split the shell in half, and then there are cashews in there. Okay, so that's a legume. And then my almonds are a nut, and the almond has been shelled for me, but the almond is a nut. And then the pumpkin seeds are achenes. The ovary wall was thin and easy to get into. So, yay. 3 kinds of fruit. And wonderful. Pumpkin, I'm sorry. So this is a legume where you can split the ovary in half and the seeds are inside. This is another legume. Split the ovary in half and the seeds are inside. This is a samara. This is a seed on a wing. And when the seed is released, it will flutter and fly, and hopefully the wind is right at that moment and it goes a long ways. But even if the wind is not right, it doesn't go a long ways. It goes some ways. This is another samara. These seeds surrounded by a wing. And they're going to go fly away. Samaras come in all different kinds of sizes and shapes. Some of them have 3 and 4 and 5 wings. Most of them have 1 or 2. This, of course, is an acorn and hard ovary wall protecting the nut. And nuts come in all kinds of shapes and sizes, right? And then an achene, very similar idea, but instead of a thick wall, it's a thin wall. So this is easier to get to the seed. Sunflower seeds, grass seeds. Okay? Fleshy fruits. Hey, some words fell off the bottom of that. So fleshy fruits, they come in lots of different categories, and again, this is just a sampling of them. A drupe has one big seed surrounded by thick flesh. So if you think of a peach or an apricot or a kumquat or a cherry or a coconut, that's the same, that's all a drupe, right? Big thick nut surrounded by lots of flesh. And then a berry has lots of small seeds surrounded by flesh, and then a thin skin that's not easy to peel. It's hard to peel a tomato. It's hard to peel a, what else is a berry? True berry. A cranberry. Okay, hard to peel these things. The peel doesn't want to leave. You wind up usually just eating the seeds with the flesh. And so those are berries. And then a hesperidium has lots of seeds and a sectioned flesh and a thick, hard rind that's easy to remove. The rind is able to be pulled off pretty simply. So there's, I didn't put a palm on here, but an apple is a palm. But here's my orange. Here's my hesperidium for you. So easily removed flesh, especially since this is a bioengineered hesperidium. And they specifically went out and found genes that make them easy to peel. But the flesh is very easy to get off. I'm sorry, the rind is very easy to get off. And then in here, there are sections of flesh, and each one of these was an ovary. And an individual ovum that got fertilized. And so there would be seeds in here if this weren't, again, a bioengineered example, where there aren't seeds. But there should be seeds in here. So this is a hesperidium, sectioned flesh, easily removed rind. This, strangely enough, is also a hesperidium. Easily removed rind, sectioned flesh, and lots of seeds in each section. So an orange and a banana fall into the same category, which is kind of weird. But they're both hesperidiums. And then a compound fruit is the result from the fusing of multiple ovaries, where you've got lots of ovaries that instead of making individual fruits, they all decide to make one fruit. And that would be strawberries and these blackberries and boysenberries back here. These are all individual ovaries that got together and made one fruit. So some pictures. Here's drupes. Lots of kinds of drupes. Coffee is a drupe. Almonds are a drupe. Oh, they are a drupe. I said they were a nut earlier. I'm wrong. The easily removed flesh and the big seed inside. Okay, so here's a dissected peach. which is something that I'm sure you find fascinating. But the thick flesh, the nut, the seed in the middle, and then surrounded by, again, some protection around the seed. Avocado is one of my favorite drupes. This is a berry. Tomatoes are berries, which is not something that you'd normally think of. But yes, little seeds, flesh, hard to peel skin. Okay, obviously blueberries are berries. Pomegranates are berries. And then in orange, sectioned flesh, seeds in the sections, easily removed, rind. And this is a compound fruit, raspberries. All of these would have had their own flowers. As a matter of fact, you can see some remnants of the flower. The little hairs on the boysenberry, those little hairs are not hairs, those are leftover flower parts. That didn't quite all fall off. Yeah. Okay. And then a fig is a compound flower, but it's inside out. All of the flower parts go to the middle, and the pollinating insect has to crawl around inside here to fertilize it all. So this is an inside-out flower on a fig. And a pineapple is a compound flower. All of these are flowers. And when the flowers are fertilized, all of the ovary fuse to make the thing we eat as a pineapple. You're scared of pineapples. And that is now forever on the video. Kiana is scared of pineapples.